All right, Jillian, you ready? You ready to get this on the road?
Absolutely.
All right, great. Well, it's noon now, everyone. Let's go ahead and let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Whitney Stoll. I'm the DC Post first vice president, and alongside me, as always, is Bree Beal, our programs director, who is hosting this team's webinar and will also be monitoring the chat. Thank you all for joining us today. We have nearly 200 participants for this from all over the country for this highly anticipated program today with Jillian. We're all excited to be here. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the June 1st Friday luncheon session. So please join me in welcoming Jillian Berdeen from Engage Federal, who will be presenting the DD Form 1391 Planning to Execute. We'll learn more about the importance of this form as part of our DoD planning, programming, budgeting, and execution of projects across the military installations around the world. But I'd like to start by welcoming to the First Friday series, which is provided to you through SAME's commitment to offering the AEC community effective training, development, and networking programs. The DC Post is helping sustain the future of the profession with these monthly education-focused sessions to deliver topical and relevant content to our industry. So thank you for all joining us here today as we start our program. But first, I'd like everyone to go ahead and turn off your video. Go ahead and mute yourself if you haven't already. And as we've mentioned, feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself to everyone throughout the presentation, where you're calling in from, your name, your company, include your LinkedIn profile. It's a great opportunity to be able to engage with everyone in the chat. If you have any questions, we'll definitely address them during the Q&A portion at the end. Again, this is a lunchtime session for those joining us on the East Coast, so feel free to eat your lunch during this program. And we're definitely glad you could join us here today, and happy to offer this virtual program to our community, regardless of where you're attending from. So let's start with a moment of silence to remember our active duty military, first responders, and all who need our care and thoughts throughout the world right now. Thank you. And please join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. So I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I'd like to take a moment to thank all of our DC Post sponsors for your support: AMT, Black & Veatch, Christopher Consultants, Consigli, Gannett Fleming, Spiniello, Stantec, WSP, Jacobs, Woods Peacock, AB Facility Service Solutions, Archie Consulting, Prime AE, and Stanley Consultants. We truly appreciate your support. We cannot be able to pull off these events without you, and are grateful for your outstanding sponsorship. Your support helps us meet our society's strategic goals, including providing excellent content to our members, industry and government engagement, building resilient communities, connecting our future leaders through student and young member groups, enriching our STEM pipeline, and preparing our military and veterans for life after service. If you're not already a DC Post sponsor and like to support our post with annual sponsorship, we'd love to add your name to the list for future programs. Please visit our website for more information about sponsors and how you can give back to the DC Post. And now it's time for the main program. And please note that this program will provide one professional development hour from the DC Post. Please look for an email with the subject line, document delivery from SAME DC and Eventbrite, with a copy of our program slides and your PDH certificate. We are recording this session, and we will post a video later on our website. So here are the learning objectives for today. I'm not gonna read all the learning objectives, since most of you saw the objectives when you registered, and instead I'm going to introduce you to our presenter. As I mentioned, please use the chat to introduce yourselves, share contact information, as well as where you're from. And throughout the presentation, share comments and questions And we'll be sure at the end of the presentation to be able to engage and talk with Jillian regarding those at the end during our Q&A. But please, right now, make sure you turn off your video and mute yourself during the presentation. And now I'd like to be able to introduce Jillian Burdeen, who is the founder and president of Engage Federal, a women-owned small business located in the Washington, D.C. area. She has 2 decades of experience. Area of expertise is development of the DoD's DD Form 1391, which is used to submit project requirements and justification in support of funding requests for MILCON and SRM projects. Jillian is a recognized expert in military facilities planning and has prepared more than 160 DD Form 1391 packages from projects ranging from $50,000 to $400 million. So Jillian, thank you for joining us here today, and I want to turn the program over to you.
Excellent. Thanks so much. I'm going to take it over. First and foremost, I love that you use the word engage in numerous things. So I feel like I owe you extra for putting my company name in the intro. Thank you to both of you for hosting this. Thank you for all the sponsors, because these events I've done, they've been doing them for a year now, and I've participated in a few of them, and they're great. They're wonderful learning sessions. So, and I'm thrilled to be able to present today. You already covered my introduction quite well. I'll just add that I'm an engineer that has turned into a planner. I think that makes me a better planner when it comes to 1391, because I'm very methodical and detailed and look at things from a very critical perspective. Over the years, 22 years of doing federal work, I've developed now, the intro had 160 and growing. So now I've done over 170 1391s. I founded my company, Engage Federal, based on that specialty skill set. So we're a specialty subconsultant providing those services. And on a personal note, I have a husband with 2 kids, 1 dog, 2 cats, and as of next week, I'll be getting a lizard. Don't tell my daughter, it's a surprise. We'll have a poll question through this, just to for me to get to know you all better, or who the audience is. So please have your phone ready, because I'm trying a new thing here. It's going to be a QR code. So that's your warning, or a website, but either whatever's easiest for you. We already talked about the learning objectives, so I'm not going to highlight those, but the agenda that we'll have today to go through those learning objectives is that we're going to do a brief introduction to the actual, the big picture 1391. Then we're going to go into how you prepare a 1391 package and what content is part of that. Then I'm actually going to take a break for questions. For me, questions are the most interesting part of these learning sessions, so I want to make sure we kind of scatter them. Plus, I just don't want to talk at you for 40 minutes. Then we're going to go into the MILCON approval process, and then trends and challenges, and then we'll have another opportunity for questions at the end. The beginning intro questions, please put those in the chat. Once we get to the end, we'll open microphones as well if you want to ask your question that way rather than the chat. So here we go. Introduction to the 1391s. First, I want to poll the audience. So here, this is what I was talking about, and hopefully it's going to update in real time. So please scan that QR code using your camera on your phone, or go to slido.com, and you're going to need to enter the number there, 426-4134. And good. I'm glad it wasn't, because it was at 100% because it was only my responses. So therefore, now we can kind of see where people are falling out here. We've got some pretty familiars. That's at the top right now. Looking good. I know. And when I looked at some of the attendee list, or folks that said they were coming, I was like, oh my gosh, you guys could be giving this presentation. So I appreciate those of you that already are familiar with 1391s and are here for just a few new nuggets or, updates. So this is good. We've got a lot of those pretty familiar, somewhat familiar, a few of those experts in the room, and then about 20% that are just here to learn and completely new. So I appreciate that separation of where the audience stands. Thank you for filling out the poll. Moving on. Oh, and I should have started when I looked at the agenda. The one thing I promised from this, is that there is more in these slides than I will be able to cover today. I wanted it to be a very good tool or resource for you and your firm later. You will be getting these slides sent to you. So please understand that when I get to a slide that has a ton of words, I'm going to tell you the high level big picture, and then I'm going to move on for some of them. Okay. But please, download the slides once you get them and use them as tools in the future. All right. So the context. This is what happens to result in a 1391, right? And so the 1391 is the result of a lot of other planning documents that are listed here. This graphic, I know it's terrible image quality, but I pulled it from a Navy document and I couldn't make it any better, but I really like the concentric circles. So it starts at the bottom with a building, then you increase to a site, you look at an area, and then you increase maybe the installation, the region, and then a global perspective. And those are from the different planning documents. Then ultimately, those may indicate you need a specific project to advance the initiatives in those planning documents. That's where 1391 comes in, when you're ready to actually program and budget for that work. And then ironically, it shrinks right back down to that building level. And that's where the 1391 is. Sometimes you'll see them at a site level, maybe an installation level, if you're dealing with infrastructure or something like that. So that's kind of the context of what drives a 1391, what results or what the 1391 is from. Now, the actual introduction to the 1391. It is a written programming document to request funding. I call it the mother may I, right? Asking for money. So it justifies all of the project details in an incredibly concise manner. That's the most important part here. Hard-hitting, concise. It is a standard form required for all military construction projects. And then SRM, which is Sustainment, Restoration, and Modernization projects, over 1.5 million. I'm going to really focus on MILCON because I think most of that is what you're here for. That military construction project will actually become a part of the president's budget request for any given year. And during that time, it will go from a 20-something page document plus a multitude of supporting documents to a 5-page summary. So if you're ever looking at the justification books for each service that goes into the president budget request, you'll see a very shortened version. That is not what is considered the full 1391. So be aware of that as well. Once it is enacted into law by Congress, signed by the president, it goes into the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA. At that point, the scope of the 1391 is binding. It is a statutory authorized limit. That is why they matter so much. You can't change it very easily. Reprogramming is incredibly challenging as well as time consuming. If you go significantly over or even significantly under, you will lose time and there are consequences. They ask a lot of questions if that starts to happen. The other thing worth noting is that MILCON funds are appropriated for 5 years. So you have 5 years to use them. When I was at a presentation last week by the Office of the Secretary of Defense, it was ironic. They were discussing that, it's a standard form. And then they said the only thing standard about it between the services is the headings of the information. And I thought that was really funny because it is actually specified, right? So the content of the 1391 is specified by the comptroller. We'll go into this in more detail, but high level, it'll have the location, which installation, the title, what the function of the building is as reflected by the category code. It'll have a cost estimate, both a very high level and a little more detailed budget estimate. Then it will have the description of the proposed construction, more of an engineering summary. Then you really get into the meat of the justification. You're going to have a requirement section, a current situation section, and an impact if not provided. The 1391 will also determine what the acquisition method is, whether design build or design bid build, and highlight a design, construction, and equipment schedule. And then it has a bunch of supporting documents, some of which are required and some of which are optional. So when I say that a 1391 might be 20 pages, it might have, I kid you not, 1,000 pages of documents supporting it. To introduce what they look like, this is just the first page of the 1391s. I should have mentioned also, you could not in an hour, cover all of the agencies that write 1391s. So I'm really highlighting Army and Navy because those are the big ones. The Army's looks like the one to the left. It is developed in the PAX 1391 processor system. The Navy's looks to the right. I being an engineer, I like the boxes. I like that it looks like a table. But it is developed in EPG, but we will talk about that because that is going to be changing, which I'm very excited about. The big thing for the 1391, we're going to talk about the who now, right? What is the audience of the 1391? And the very tricky part is it has a lot of audiences and it changes through the review cycle. Ultimately, the goal is to create a 1391 that can convince all of these audiences that the project is needed enough to forego other financial things, right? So you've got to prove that. So it starts at the installation or department that says we have a need. We need this facility for some reason. Then you move on to the region or the district, and they put that into the regional context. Then you'll be looking at the enterprises, which might be, the warfare enterprises, for example, and they're going to go into a bigger picture of how is this need impacting the overall mission. Then once you go up to an even higher level of the service or the agency, perhaps the Navy or the Army in this case, it'll be how does this help this need? If we provide this project that meets this need, how will it help the mission? They're going to also start to actually ask the questions of will it successfully compete and will it get through the budget process? They don't want to spend money on something that's going to flop, right? If it makes it through that, it'll then go up to FMB or the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So you're starting to look at it from a budgetary level. And they're going to say, does it support the rest of our programs or our initiatives? They're going to ask the hard questions of why do we need it now? Because if they can push it back a year or two, they will do that. And they're going to also determine if it's overpriced and if it meets the needs. And most importantly, is it executable, as written? If not, you go back to the drawing board. And then ultimately, Congress is looking out for their own interests of their own constituents. So they're going to be asking questions about that. They're going to be asking questions about overall national strategy, national defense strategies. And then the what are we giving up in order to fund this project? So they're weighing the pros and cons of it. So those are some of the examples of audience interests. Obviously, at the installation level, you're going to have a ton of stakeholders just there as well. You're talking to environmental, you're talking to the engineers, you're talking to the planners, security specialists, etc. So there are a lot more stakeholders involved as well, but this is kind of a highlight of them. This is the how. So here are the resources that I told you I'm not going to go into in detail. But this is kind of a tool for you to use for the major services. Some of the key resources, if you're doing the planning, you're developing the requirements, you're looking at what software you might need. And then I just threw in a bunch of additional resources that I regularly use. Big thing here, which like I said, things are changing. So the programs that have been used for the Navy and the Air Force are actually transitioning to be the same program that the Army is using. So they're transitioning to the PAX processor system. Super excited about this. I don't know the timeline, but that means that the PAX processor system is now going to at least cover like 20 agencies and is growing. So that's going to kind of become the gold standard and the standardization of developing 1391s. Now we're moving on. Get ready. We're going to do another poll soon, so please have your phones out. We're going to talk about the content and development preparation of the 1391. And the biggest thing I can say is it takes a team. We all, depending on our roles, contribute to this, right? And I liked this Henry Ford quote where it says, coming together is the beginning, staying together is progress, and working together is success. And the only way that the 1391 is executable, which is successful, is if you have a team approach to it. You have to be incredibly collaborative. So then here's your next poll. What is your role or your specialty area in the federal market? And I kind of want to get an idea, since we're working as a team, what our team members are that are listening right now. 1391s are touched by a lot of different team members. So yeah, take your time to get in here, use that QR code, go to a website real quick. You guys are on it. Look at that, 22 responses already. Thank you. I have to scroll down to see the other. Oh, I'm thrilled with how much government representation we have on right now as well. And I got a shout out to my cost estimating colleagues, because cost estimating and my planning work go hand in hand, developing 1391s. Okay, awesome. So this is a great snapshot. So we've got a lot of architecture, planning, engineering, and business development. Hopefully you folks with the business development, I'm gonna touch on a few things that you can leverage from these planning documents to inform your business development as well. We'll get to that, I think, kind of in the second half of the presentation. All right, thank you for those responses. All right, so I like to start the 1391 by, you first have to define the work classification, okay? So it falls into 3 major groups, which is repair, which includes maintenance, conversion, demolition. And some of those are recent changes, actually. Conversion used to be more construction. Now it can fall under repair with some limitations. Construction, which can be minor construction, unspecified minor construction, or military or MILCON major construction. That includes alterations, additions, extensions, replacements, or equipment. Now, and I should have mentioned, all of these little yellow boxes that you'll see through the presentation are kind of my tips and tricks from my years of experience, and kind of where do you start, or what the important items are, right? These call out boxes. So first you need to determine this work classification, because that's going to help you determine the correct funding, right? Once you know approximately what the project cost is going to be, there's different funding buckets you can pull from, okay? And that's based on both things, classification of work and the cost threshold. We'll get into that in a moment. So then you determine your project type, whether it might be an SRM project or a MILCON project. Very important, because some funding types cannot be combined in a single project. You might end up having to do 2 projects or more. So work classification matters a lot. The other thing that's worth noting here on this slide is that if you determine that the project, the work classification, can be covered by O&M or by MILCON, as you can see from this chart, the O&M numbers are the largest blue boxes, right? So we're talking in $250 billion. That's how much annually. When you look back down, way down on the chart, those little dark blue boxes, that's MILCON. So it's like a 1% of, MILCON is 1% when it comes to O&M. Now, O&M is not just for facilities, obviously, but as you can tell, the bucket is much larger in that for facility improvements. All right. So that's why I just wanted to provide that chart kind of as context when you look at this. You can also see some of the trends over the last 10 years of what the O&M and the MILCON cycles have been through. Once you determine the work classification, as I mentioned, it'll guide you to whether or not you are looking at an SRM project or a construction project. There are differences between the two. I'm going to focus on a couple of these. SRM project, when you write the 1391, you're going to really focus on the building systems and the deficiencies of that specific building. In contrast, when you're doing a military construction project, you're focusing on the mission need. It's got to go all the way up to Congress. Congress doesn't care if your building is ugly or if it's too hot, or sometimes they care if it's too moldy. But you can, you have to determine your audience, right? So MILCON is mission. SRM is going to be less detailed, less involved, and require a lower level of effort. It'll require a lower approval authority as well. Sometimes with certain thresholds, it will have to go up for congressional notification, and they will have 14 days to either reply and, provide input, or if that 14 days passes, you can move forward. That's considered approval authority, and you can move forward with that SRM project. But that's at certain higher levels, up into the millions of dollars for SRM projects. As I mentioned, review and level of scrutiny varies. As you can anticipate, a $10 million project compared to a $400 million project is going to have quite a bit of difference in scrutiny as well, even in MILCON. The 1391 formats themselves are different. So if you know you're doing an SRM project, you will go into those software programs and choose a different form. And then it will have other sections that are not applicable to you. So the forms are different. SRM projects will also have you compare a repair to replacement ratio. We're going to talk about that in a moment. So it's considering how much are you spending on repair compared to how much would it be for new construction. And then ultimately, economic analyses are a supporting document that are required. They are absolutely required for all MILCONs. And then requirements do vary, and they vary between the services as well for the thresholds where economic analyses are required for SRM projects. So if you're working an SRM project, you're going to want to know what those economic analysis requirements are. As I mentioned, the repair to replacement threshold. There are some breaking points that you should be aware of. And this is for you engineers who are like, I don't really care about the 1391. Well, you're here, so you have to care. So thank you. But for those of you that need to keep in mind what your 1391 preparation person is keeping in mind. Anything for that would be repair ratio of 75% of more is the breaking point where replacement may be best. Anything close to 75% is going to get scrutinized more. Anything above 30% of that repair to replacement ratio is going to require seismic evaluation and retrofits if you're in certain building classifications. Same thing for ATFP, it's going to be over 50%. And then same thing for fire protection, over 50%. So these are things you really need to keep in mind. I also didn't provide all the different agencies and what they require, but certain ones are like over 50% repair to replacement ratio will require an economic analysis. So you've got to know about some of those as well. So these are very important to keep in mind as you, the engineers, are working and the cost estimators are working. It very much impacts your 1391 planners. And then here's some exciting, if you're a 1391 nerd like me, some exciting construction funding thresholds that have been changing recently, meaning in the National Defense Authorization Act of 2023. So minor construction used to be anything less than 2 million could be paid for with operations and maintenance, or O&M funds. This year it increased to greater than or less than 4 million rather. And then you can apply an area cost factor. The DoD every year puts out area cost factors for your local areas, the installations themselves. Note, if you are trying to use these though, the area cost factor must be from the previous fiscal year. So keep that in mind. You cannot use the current area cost factor. You are using the previous fiscal year, right? Then for unspecified minor construction, it used to be a limit of 6 million. Less than 6 million. So now you can have an unspecified minor construction project that is less than 9 million with an increase for the area cost factor using the previous year, but you can only go up to a max of $14 million. Some of the area cost factors in certain remote locations are quite high. This also applies for laboratory revitalization programs, which is kind of a special program, special consideration. So for those that are working on any LRP projects, you also got to bump up to that maximum of 14 million with the area cost factor. And then of course there's major construction, which could be deemed anything over 4 million, and that would go the military construction route. All right. The next thing to determine in your 1391 preparation is your scope, right? The most important part is the scope, right? The cost is determined by the scope. The scope and the costs are both locked in as soon as the 1391 is enacted. Very important to realize that gets enacted typically at 35% design. So you have got to figure that stuff out early, anything that's going to impact scope or cost. Then, as I mentioned, reprogramming is difficult to ask for more money. The scope includes both the primary facility and the supporting facilities. So anything site related, any demolition, things like that, you're going to need locked in as well. So really focus on those expensive items. And then the scope is based on the function of the building, which is reflected by the category code. That category code is basically the first thing you should lock in with your client. You need to talk to them about what the function of the facility is going to be. Determine what the category code is, because category codes will help you determine your allowances or whether there's standards, right? The Army has a whole center of standardization. And for some projects, the functions of the buildings, there are already standards there. You need to use those, but it takes a huge, the guessing game is gone. You're going to start with the standard. I think this was actually from another First Friday webinar that Faithful Gold did, but I loved this image because it's basically explaining that at the planning stage, you have a lot of opportunity to make changes, and the cost impact of making those changes is very low. And then as you move into design, those start to change. And then once you're in construction, you don't have much ability to make any changes. And you're also, if you do make those changes, the cost implication is going to be very significant. So I just loved that visual. And it just proves this whole lock in that scope early and make sure you're asking all the right questions. All right, now we're going into the actual preparation, right? So these are blocks 1 through 8. It's considered the header data. At the top, you can see what the Army looks like. At the bottom, you can see what the Navy looks like. Lesson learned, especially you cost estimators on the phone, as well as you engineers. Determine if the 1391 needs to be provided in metric. I know we don't like using metric. It's not what we typically use, but some are required to be in metric. Others I'm seeing agencies get waivers in order to use English systems. 1391 processor has an option for both unit types, so that's awesome. Navy EPG does not, so you will have to manually enter both. They actually want to see the square footage, and you have to hand enter that, and then you'll be providing in the cost portion the quantities in metric. Kind of a pain. The importance of the category code, I mentioned this on the previous slide, but part of this header data in block 6 is the category code. You can see some of the other abbreviations for how people reference category code. As a reminder, that's the function of the facility. And the importance of choosing the right category code, there's only one. You get one for the project. That is the primary category code. So you might have 5 total projects or total category codes in your primary facilities that you're impacting. The one that is the majority becomes the primary category code. That design use category code will stick with that project unless it's officially converted later. So it's very important to get it right in the first place, or it's a process and red tape to change it later. And as I mentioned, that category code is used to develop the requirements. So that's why it's so critical to get it right. Moving on to block 9, these are the costs, all you cost estimators on the phone. You're going to have, 4 major types of costs. You're going to have the primary facility cost, which is basically the building itself and anything that connects immediately to the building. So we call it the 5-foot line. You're going to have the supporting facility costs, anything outside the 5-foot line. That'll be your parking, your storm drainage, any site demolition, things like that. Then there's some standard markups. And then a separate category, because it's not MILCON funded, will be equipment from other appropriations. So there is a line item. You can see it down here at the very bottom. It is not in the ultimate MILCON cost that gets provided up on the 1391, but it is a line item at the bottom of the front page. Some of the major cost drivers that you obviously need to consider, we talked about scope. Execution year, especially in times like we're dealing with where escalation is pretty significant. So that execution year is incredibly important. Special design criteria. Recently, we have the requirement for RF shielding in secure facilities. And a few years back, obviously, with ATFP came the progressive collapse requirements that added significant percentages. Things like that need to be realized and documented early. Though same thing with your site selection and any site improvements. You basically can't develop a 1391 without a site because you wouldn't know those costs and those cost drivers. Are you demolishing buildings? Are those buildings just sheds that you're basically pushing over and cleaning up? Are those buildings laden with explosives and you have decontamination costs? Those can add up very quickly. Are they 4-foot concrete structures? Makes a huge difference. Typically, the supporting facilities falls in alignment of about 15 to 25% of the primary facility cost. So if you're looking for big ballpark numbers, those can kind of get you there when you're looking at your initial ROM estimate. After that, you need a site to be able to identify those. So because hand in hand, 1391s and construction or cost estimates go hand in hand, I'm kind of going to harp on this for a moment. And this is for all of you. So if you're an architecture or an engineering firm and you are the lead, please keep these things in mind. Prior to developing the engineering cost estimate, please agree on a format, agree on the content and the level of detail that will be provided. You're going to want to confirm that project year and specify the construction start, the construction duration, because that leads you to the midpoint. The midpoint is what the entire project is escalated to. All right, so that midpoint is incredibly important. Duration matters. You're going to know whether it's a design build or a design bid build document. I mean, acquisition approach, because design build adds 4% to the project. You're going to want all of the quantities in an easily referenced and editable document. Okay, so if you have your site civil folks, please have them provide all of the quantities so there's no guessing. And the person in the 1391, developing the 1391, will have the same quantities that the cost estimator will have because they need to match. So the big things, obviously the new construction, any renovation, demolition, utilities, roads, parkings, fencing, sidewalks, right? All of that. Then you're also going to want to document any unusual items or special design items. I really like seeing that in the basis of costs. There should be some sort of basis of cost document that goes with the M2 or PACES or whatever system you're using for your cost estimate. So anything really unusual that's going to have a big cost, go ahead and talk about it. Then you need to determine as a group where your markups are going to be applied. Do you want them in the cost estimate or do you want them only in the 1391? Those markups might be contingency, design factors, supervision, inspection, overhead, the SIO costs, okay? Then there are some other requirements, and so cybersecurity is a recent example. Energy and sustainability. Some of those have in the beginning a 2% for energy and sustainability factor, for example. You want to determine if those are going to be applied in the cost estimate or if, again, those are going to be added in for the 1391. Make sure you're talking. And then ultimately, you want to be able to cross-reference your site plan with all the cost descriptions and quantities. They need to match. All right, so those are I'll get off my soapbox now, but those are some of the recommendations. While you're even in like fee proposal, you can start thinking about these things. Block 10. All right, here's where the engineering description really comes in. So if you're in the engineering side, this is where your planners are going to be asking you questions or looking at your reports in order to get this level of information. So it's a high-level engineering description of the building. It describes all of the features of the work and anything that is in the primary and supporting facilities. It includes also a bunch of standard statements that are required, and the Navy's and the Army's vary, but there's a bunch of standard statements that need to be addressed. The big thing that I'm showing you here with this graphic that, again, you probably can't read, but is that the cost block in block 9 and the description of proposed construction need to match. You're going to be describing what's estimated and you're estimating what's described. So therefore, really do a QA. Like somebody could do a QA just on those when they're reviewing the 1391. And if you're identifying issues there, it might ultimately lead to issues in both your report and your cost estimate. Transitioning to block 11, this is the requirements section where most of your primary text sections are going to be. It's concise description of what the project will do. That's the project. Your requirement section is going to be why it's needed, whether it's a mission or a safety or environmental, whatever, why it's needed, right? And you're trying to quantify and provide data and examples for all of these items. Your current situation, will describe how the requirements being met currently, or if it's not being met at all. And you're going to provide why things are impacted, how the mission is impacted by that. And then impact if not provided. This means this project, if it doesn't happen, what will happen to the mission? So you might have a safety issue that obviously is just going to get worse. You might have a notice of violation that obviously is going to get worse or lead to fines, something like that. Big tip and trick here, develop the text in Microsoft Word prior to copying it into the 1391 because the software is incredibly clunky. It does not make spell checks easy. It does not make grammar checks easy. And it also, it doesn't even make scrolling and copying, pasting very easy. The blocks are tiny and you might have a lot more text that you're actually entering. So that is one of my tips. The same thing, the agency itself might have some consistency guidelines or editing and style guidelines. The Navy does. If you are developing a 1391, ask for those. Another tip and trick for all of you that are developing reports that go into the 1391, look at those guidelines. Align your reports, help the planner and help the government by aligning those reports with the same thing. So it might be something like spell out percent rather than using percent. It specifies the number of spaces between sentences. There's all sorts of details in it, but that would be my recommendation for your reports. Along with the 1391, in block 12, you're going to have supporting information. Here are a long list of the potential supporting documents. I'm going to highlight a couple of them. The important thing here when I look at this would be, this is what 1391 processor looks like. You can see that tab A is considered the 1391. Tabs B through J are the rest of the supporting documents. So this gives you an idea of how much other stuff is in the system that you don't even see if you only look at the 1391. And obviously then everything gets attached to the project in EPG or 1391 processor as well. All right, I'm going to focus on supporting documents that are the site plan. It needs to align with the cost estimate quantities in the 1391. I think I've harped on that enough. You're going to want to request any GIS layers prior to the start of the meeting, at the kickoff, or at the charrette. The sooner you get them, the better. Okay, so because you've got to look at all that to consider what your constraints are. And also, please look at the natural and environmental constraints. I think a lot of engineers just want to map out their systems and not necessarily look at, floodplains, huge issue right now, wetlands, species habitat, etc. There is also another supporting document called the economic analysis. During fee proposal, talk with the client to determine the type of economic analysis. The levels of effort vary greatly. So it would help your planner if they know if it's a smaller level of effort, which would be a nominal or a partial mission requirement economic analysis, or if it's a full mission economic analysis. And I could obviously spend hours just on economic analyses, but I won't. And then the system that is used standard is Econ Pack rather for economic analysis. So find someone who's familiar with Econ Pack. You're going to have equipment lists for that other equipment from other appropriations. Same thing during fee proposal. Talk about that. Figure out who's doing it. Critical piece. And same with environmental. You have to understand the constraints of the site. It will impact construction cost or schedule. So figure out who's going to talk about these things. I know that sometimes those get removed from scope when you're in fee proposal, but even during that stage, then you need to have someone who's going to be at the charrette asking the questions or on the phone asking the questions that understands it. Someone has to speak the language. And for the government folks, please don't descope environmental because it could have such a huge impact later on your the project's executability if the correct questions haven't been asked early in planning. Okay. Oh my gosh. So that is the general 1391. We do have two more sections coming up, but in the meantime, I'm going to see if any questions came in and we'll give a quick moment for that. Whitney, on to you then. Did anything come in?
Well, Jillian, you did a great job and really appreciate the breakdown. I know it's a it's a lot, but I will dive right into it. And for those on, please feel free to type your questions into the chat. We'll do our best to be able to address them. And I know we have some in there right now, but I'll one question right off the top. You mentioned 1391s are different between the services. Can you provide some examples, of the differences, or an example of something you think should be consistently applied across all the services?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so first and foremost, which they've already determined is a challenge, and are evidently going to fix it. The different systems that were being used, right? They were all set up in different ways. So I'm thrilled that they are all transitioning to the PAX 1391 processor system. So that's one thing, right? Another item that I really like from the Army and the Air Force that the Navy, sorry, Navy, don't mean to call you out. You were my first 1391 though. So is a related projects section. Sometimes there are projects that, because of the funding sources, they have to be separate, but they're so critical, right? One needs to happen before the other, so they're interconnected. So there are those sections that have related projects, and I like how that is laid out in the Army and the Air Force. That's the one example I can think of quickly.
Okay, great. We have from James Hodges. He asks, any suggestions or best practices for non-CAC consultants providing 1391 to the military service clients in their systems where a CAC is required to have access to their systems?
Yeah, so that's a question during fee proposal. I state this as someone who has a CAC, so I don't have to worry about it too much. But you're going to want to talk with folks during fee proposal, right? You're going to want to find out if the government is going to be willing to take a Word document or an Excel file from you. And some of them actually prefer that. They don't want you working in their system. My clients have usually worked with me enough where there's a trust level, and so they know I'm not going to screw anything up in their own system. But sometimes that's just part of their QA procedure, and they'd rather have it separate. The other, so it's just about building that expectation in. If they're adamant that it must be in the system, but for some reason they say that you can't get a CAC, for example, not to talk about my services, but sometimes I've had people come to me just for that, right? They're going to do most of the work. I'm going to provide maybe a QA of the 1391, and then I'm going to be the one that enters it into the system just because I have access into that system. So those would be kind of my workarounds, but definitely in that fee proposal stage, you need to be having those questions or getting those questions asked. There are ways that you can get certificates, is my understanding, with the Navy. I have not needed them because I have my CAC instead. I'm not sure if that's going to change when they change from EPG to the Army's 1391 processor system. But good question, and it is a hurdle, definitely, getting your CAC, Common Access Card, for those of you that might not be familiar with that acronym.
Great. So Joseph Wells and Andrew Kern, I believe, asked the same question, but why are A&E costs included at a standard 4%? And Andrew asked, why does DB add 4%? So I take it's the same question.
So it's the additional effort required from the government in order to manage a design build contract rather than design bid build, right? There's more acquisition, contracting, things like that, and oversight required because it's not the same company. That's my understanding. I'm sure some of the government folks on the line might actually be able to more eloquently answer that. But that is my understanding for why that is. And it's, like I said, it is a standard. It'll be set for everything.
Got it. Gib Little asked, let's see, might also be site boundary or access. Okay, I think that's just a comment on one of the questions. Might also be site boundary or access constraints that impact costs. That might have been,
sure.
Yeah.
Oh, for sure. Oh my gosh, yeah. Security premiums huge right now. So if you're going through multiple gates, if you have to be escorted, right? I mean, we have a project now that I'm looking at. There's for the entire duration of construction, 24 months, we have 4 escorts that we're paying labor for. So yeah, definitely huge costs.
Let's see. So we have from Jeffrey Potts. Can you go over the 30% threshold for seismic again? What is the significance of that threshold?
All right, so I'm going to make this really short because I'm by no means a structural engineer. So my understanding is basically, why would you renovate the building if, or spend too much money, right? More than 30% to renovate a building if it's not structurally sound. So especially in areas with hurricanes or earthquakes, right? So they're above 30%, you're going to need to do an evaluation. It might just be, we are in a location that does not have high risk of seismic issues, and that might be done, right? But if not, then you might actually have to do a survey, a study of the structural of the building to determine if seismic additions need to be, or enhancements need to be made with that repair project, because they don't want to spend the money and have the building fall down. That's my high level explanation of that one.
Great. I appreciate that.
Right. Whitney, you know what I'm going to do? Sorry to interrupt you, but given the time, I don't know how many other questions we had, but let's go ahead. And for all of you, I am totally fine staying after, but I want to be really cognizant of time. So I'm going to try to rush through the next couple of slides. It's more than a couple. And then we can do questions at the end once we wrap up the presentation, or anyone that has additional questions, I'm happy to stay after. I'm also happy to have you contact me after.
We got about 5 minutes left because I have a few things to close out. So you got about 5. So
exactly. Okay. So moving on, we're going to quickly talk about the review and approval process. So this is military construction. We're talking military construction now. So the review process is part of the planning, programming, budgeting, and execution. If you ever see the acronym PPBE, that is what we're talking about. The planning is obviously what we're talking about, what it's needed, how much is needed. It's quantifying the mission need, right? Programming is when it starts to look at, how does the project score? Does it rank well? How is it prioritized? Ultimately, your goal is to be included in the integrated priority list, the IPL, and the future year defense program, the FIDUP. Then budgeting. They're looking at, is it too high, too low? Is it executable? They're going to review and audit the costs and to ensure the project can actually move forward and the cost is correct. And then ultimately you're in execution, you're construction, right? So you're constructing, you're doing occupation, you're doing closeout. And the ultimate goal of this entire process is a new facility that meets the mission that's required. Quick update on how it goes through this process. Every year there's a program objective memorandum, a POM cycle. All right, so that's where all the projects in 1391s are provided into the POM cycle at the installation level, and then looked at the region level, right? Then they move forward. You wanted them to be prioritized enough they get onto the integrated priority list. And then from there, the next is to get onto the future years defense program, the FIDUP. That is actually something that lists the program over a 6-year period. So the 2-year budgeted and then 4 extra years. It's updated twice through the PPBE process in August and September in order to reflect the POM submissions that are coming in. And then again in January of the following year in order to reflect the presidential budget. Okay. And then for all of you business development folks, you're probably like, how do I get my hands on that 6-year project list? You can't. For the military services, you can't. It's classified, so you can't see it. However, if you're working for military, DoD agencies, it's available. Go to look up DoD agency FIDUP and you'll be able to find it. So that is a huge reference tool if you're not leveraging that already. This is just a quick graphic from an Army Corps learning course to show you that during any one year, and please excuse the fact that we are here is a little old, it should have been pushed to the right a little bit, but any one year, they're working on 5 POM cycles. They're working on 5 years of projects, whether it's in planning, design, OSD review and presidential budget, or then into construction. So very important to kind of see the scale of what they're dealing with, what the agencies are dealing with on any given year, and where those programs are in the sequence. This is what the congressional process looks like as it gets to Congress, right? So up here in the right corner, you're going to see where Public Works or the installation engineers actually determine if it's going to be MILCON funded. If not, it goes off the page to the left. Did I say up in the right? Left. I can tell the difference. So then it goes through the MILCON cycle. They show this as being a 5+ years timeline. That timeline is very generous. It can actually sit up there at the installation for 3. I've even had up to 10 years before it moved on to OSD reviews. But this will guide you through what those levels of review are, who the different stakeholders are, and then how the sequencing happens, right? So we've already talked about some of those when we talked about audience interests. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this is another really useful tool for you. Ultimately, as the MILCON goes through, it'll go through 4 levels of congressional committees to be reviewed. Typically, about 80 or 90% of those projects are marked and approved without any changes or deletions. Then, as I mentioned, it gets authorized and signed, enacted into law, okay? There's the 5-year availability of funds, and it also indicates 2 years of funds for planning and design. Again, business development folks might be thinking, ooh, how do I get my hands on that list? It does not have line item budgets. It is literally just planning and design. So you will not see projects or states or anything for that information. This is an important one. Projects without authorization cannot be carried out. However, in any given year, some MILCON projects can be authorized by Congress, but not appropriated, meaning they think the project is important enough, but they're not designating funds to it yet. If funds do become available through reprogramming or another project hits a huge milestone or hurdle and it can't happen that year, that means that money can move to that authorized MILCON and then it will be appropriated. Okay, so kind of that's the only wiggle room that the DoD really has in moving funds around. All right, and then quickly, some trends and challenges. The National Defense Authorization Act is your most important tool. Use it, leverage it. Here are some themes from this year's and the link to it. These are some of the 2023 defense spending rose by 9%. If you're working for the DoD, you're in a really good place right now. This highlights where some of those MILCON investments are happening. And then the challenges. And so there's a lot of them: long lead times, near peer adversaries, unanticipated priorities, lack of competition. That's what this form shows. And then ultimately your trends. So again, I'm not reading through these given our time. I'm so sorry that we're running late, but you can go back to those to get an idea. And with that, I turn it over to Whitney.
No, that was great, Jillian. Thank you for that. And I know there's a lot in there, and please feel free to everyone to reach out to Jillian if you have any questions. And all the slides will be available. But thank you again. This is definitely very, very informative and impactful, especially with everything that goes into the 1391s. And everyone, thank you for participating in today's session. We really appreciate your time being with us today. Very informative, and we had a lot of interest from our participants here today. So thank you all again. But before we wrap up our program here today, I'd like to share some of our upcoming events that we do have planned. So please mark your calendar for our upcoming local post events, as well as some of our upcoming national events. We are committed to bringing more content and fun events throughout the rest of the year. The national website is being refreshed, so look out for events on the post page with a slightly new address. Please add Classic to our website to get the full calendar of events. Our next First Friday session is on July 7th, which is unlocking the potential of ChatGPT and large language models for proposals, presented by Catherine Bennett, a proposal industry experts. As always, SAME members can attend for free. And this month, we're opening up free registration to our friends at SMPS and APMP to support our young professionals in marketing and business development. As always, participants will earn 1 hour PDH. Registration is open now. Our next program is June 7th, is our NIH AEC Opportunities and Project Tour. It is a limited event, and we've already sold out. If you'd like to be added to the wait list, please send an email to the email address below. And then on June 20th, we have our joint conference with the DC Post with ACEC and the CMMA NCC, and that has actually just sold out this week. Also, if you'd like to be added to the wait list, please email the link, the email below. And then SAME's largest conference this year is going to be the Federal Small Business Conference, which is going to be held November 1st through the 3rd in San Antonio. Call for presentations is out, and those abstracts are due back on June 12th. Registration starts mid-July, and if you want to save, please register early. If you're interested in learning more how to start a nomination for an SAME fellow, join the live webinar on Tuesday, June 13th. This information session is required for all nominees and nominators to attend and view the recording prior to submitting the packet. You can find out more information on eligibility, nomination forms, and the login link on the SAME Academy of Fellows website. And new this year, National is hosting a Department of State OBO Industry Day right here in DC at the end of June. Registration for this day-and-a-half event is open now. And finally, we've already started planning our programming into the fall and to save the date for the upcoming DC Post events, which are listed here for our first Friday in August, resolving issues, avoiding conflict, and preserving claims on construction contracts. We're busy planning for a weekend in September for our annual DC Mid-Maryland and Mid-Atlantic Team River Runner Family Day with kayaking and picnic on the Potomac. And there's a save the date for the DC Post golf tournament, which will be held out at Andrews on October 4th. Sponsorships are available. If you're interested, you can please reach out to Brian Moore. His contact information is below. And so be sure to visit our website, the market calendar for all upcoming events, as well as national events as well. And again, thank you to Jillian for providing excellent content today. And please look out for document delivery on the slides, as well as your PDH certificate. And the recording will be on the DC Post website later on this month. Have a great weekend, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you all at our next event soon. So thank you again, and have a great day.
Sorry we went long, guys.
I
will.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll be on if anybody wants to ask any other questions that I didn't get to in the chat. I'll stay on for a few minutes.
If Jillian, if you open up you're getting a lot of kudos in the chat, so it's.
Thank you. I saw that. You guys are so
okay.
kind.
But if you scroll up a little bit, you could. I think there's a couple of questions starting with Nick Desports on sharing some of his experience. Can you share any? There are a couple of questions. If you see where Nick's question is.
I see. Yeah. So the question itself is, can you share any information you know about the DD Form 1390 in your experience? In working with the National Guard, their 1390 was a significant requirements document. Ironically, I've never worked for the National Guard, so no, I can't share any experience. I'm sure Nick, in that case, is more experienced than I am. But I've had recent conversations with the National Guard about them moving into 1391 requirements. So I'd be curious about how the 1390 is different than the 1391. But I'm not knowledgeable about that, so I'm not going to pretend to be. And then Mike, is Mike still on?
Yes. How are you, Jillian?
Hi, Mike. I'm doing well. Okay, you have a lot of acronyms in this question. So I'm going to let you ask it, if that's okay, rather than me, because you'll know what those all mean. Can you define them as you ask the question?
Well, so .milpif is a framework that looks, the last thing it looks at is buildings. Everyone rushes to build stuff and get their 1391 filled out, but often the problems aren't the buildings, it's the doctrine, the organization, the training, the material, the leadership, the people, and then the facilities. So that's a DoD framework, and I suspect you've heard it before. Aligned to that is the Joint Capabilities Integration Documentation System, the JSID system. These are all frameworks that build like aircraft carriers and tanks, and and for our facilities, as complex as they are, ought to benefit from this type of due diligence and planning. And I know that's what we did at the DHS level. And I'm just wondering if, when you start at 1391, do you say, okay, have we looked at the leadership? Maybe it's not a building problem, maybe it's a leadership problem. And I know that may not be your job, but we want to do things right at the end.
Yeah,
you can build
absolutely.
a great building and find out it's a doctrine problem.
Absolutely. And so I'll answer that in a couple of parts. First, you're usually not under contract to do that, right? Like your contract will say develop the 1391. Now, I approach everything with a very critical eye, and I want to always ask the hard questions. Usually, you're hoping that if they're asking for a 1391 to be developed, they've gone through some of those doctrine. Is it leadership? What is the need, right? And they've identified that they think it's a facility. Therefore, it's on you to document that backup documentation, right? And go through, where's the proof? Where's your proof statement that it is a building that's needed? There have been times, that's why when people ask me, what's your success rate with 1391s? I'm like, I've written every 1391 I've been asked to write. That's my success rate. Because there are times when I'm like, you have no project here. This is not something that taxpayers should be spending money on. And sometimes it will come out in those types of things that there are other ways. Another way that they look at that, not so much from are there other sources, but in the economic analysis, you're going to be developing whether or not it could be renovation or more sustainment funding, leasing, contractors. You look at those alternatives, and that might be another area when you are gathering the information to complete the economic analysis, you actually identify that it's not a facility need. So pretty quickly, you learn those things, but for the most part, it's not really part of your scope to question
quickly,
too much.
I'll let you go. But do you usually get a mission needs statement before you get the 1391? Like, here's our MINS document?
Usually they will provide whatever, yes, either missions or like personnel or this new platform's coming on, right? So those sorts of things, you need to ask for those. Yes, absolutely. Sometimes they provide it without you asking, but you always want to be asking for those. So yeah, and that becomes your justification for whether the project flies or not. And believe me, like I said, I've supported plenty that do not score well, and then they die on the vine.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so let's see, scrolling back down. Any advice on long-term inflation escalation and managing general risks using budget contingency? Oh, I love this question. So the Army Corps uses a 5% contingency across the board from start to finish. I've got to choose my words carefully. The Navy, on the other hand, does not. In the early planning stages, before usually it's mostly planners, no engineers yet involved, no design performed, 50% contingency factor. So that's how they get around those concerns. And I meant to say in the presentation, never provide a cost in the early stages that as if it's locked in. In all of my charrette reports, when I'm doing outbriefs or something, I provide a range of costs. I increase that contingency because we don't know much yet, to higher percentages. Once you provide one number, they lock onto it and it starts to get advertised. So I think the Navy's pretty smart in starting with a 50% contingency. Then once it goes through AE review, verification, validation, true site surveys, etc., it drops down to 10, and ultimately it's 5 at the end. But it changes through the review cycle, which I really like. That is another, actually, going back to that question of what could be standardized and what might benefit from a standardization perspective. That would be one of the other things. Let's see. And then I would just say from, escalate using the most current guidance, and have it be a separate line item cost so everyone can understand that it's X% is escalation, right? So that way, if it changes throughout the project, when you hand it off to the next designer or the next planner, they will know and then be able to adjust accordingly. Scrolling back down in the chat to see if there's any other comments. The slides will be sent. Did you see any, Bree?
No more questions. If anybody still on the line has final questions? All right. Well, then I think this was a great program. Thank you so much, Jillian. We appreciate you coming out and sharing this with all of our members. Everybody who was attending today, who, if you registered, you should have already received an email from us with the slides and also your PDH certificate. So if you don't see that, just send us a note and we can send it to you. And then we will take this recording, do a little bit of editing to it, and then add it to our YouTube series, and then put it on our DC Post website so that everybody can watch any parts that they may have missed or review stuff that they're still interested in.
All right, I'm scrolling through all you that hung in here till the very bitter end. So good to see so many of your names. Hi, Carl. Hi, Christine. So great. So thank you so much. Hi, Joe. Thank you. Thank you for participating. If you guys, I'm just going to throw this out there because it's we're a quaint group of friends now. If you guys think any of these topics are absolutely something that more of the folks in SAME or our industry should know about, let me know, because SAME right now for the Small Business Conference is putting out the calls for abstracts. And, being a 1391 nerd, I could talk about this all the time, but if you think others would benefit from this type of information, give me a shout out, let me know so I can maybe put in an abstract. So.
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, Bree. I spoke last year, so I wasn't going to this year, but the topic would be totally different. So anyway, that's it. Thank you guys so much for participating. Enjoy your weekend. Thank you, Bree. Thank you, Whitney. Awesome program that you do here.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.